Pursuit of progress.
Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Haynes. Tonight on Greater Boston, a new report confirms allegations of widespread racial and gender discrimination at the Massachusetts Convention Center Authority. We'll dig into those findings and what's next for the authority ahead. Plus, businesses from Amazon to your local fitness studio are weighing in on the war between Israel and Hamas. Should they be? Two crisis PR experts join me. At the Massachusetts Convention Center Authority, Black and Hispanic employees are paid less, denied promotions, and left isolated and marginalized. That's according to an independent report from the law firm Prince Lobel Ty, who were asked by the authority to investigate allegations of discrimination that surfaced earlier this year. They determined current leadership prioritizes its bottom line over racial equity and inclusion and has fostered a culture of distrust in human resources and a fear of retaliation for speaking out. Executive Director David Gibbons responded to that report, calling its recommendations for diverse recruitment and mentorship, quote, truly worthy and provides instructive guidance. But the authority says that they are still reviewing the specific complaints here and haven't yet addressed any of them directly. Well, Tori Bedford has been covering this story for GBH News and was the first to report on the findings of the Prince Lobel Ty investigation. She joins me now, as does Representative Bud Williams, chair of the legislature's Joint Committee on Racial Equity, Civil Rights and Inclusion. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
So,
Thanks, Crystal.
Yeah, of course. Tori, I have to ask you, this has so many tendrils. We were talking off camera about this and so many compound issues. Talk to me about how you began this reporting.
Well, I think we've heard these rumors for a long time, and I've done previous reporting about letters of condemnation about business practices, calls for increasing diversity, calls for an audit. The Black and Latino Caucus some years ago came out with a letter complaining about allegations. Several employees of color wrote a letter to the Attorney General's office and the governor now, Maura Healey, asking about issues that had come up, and I think they call it just like a systemic suppressal of issues when they come up. I mean, they were describing inequity, they were describing people being paid less, they were describing just being subjected to just awful racist humor, jokes and comments, and not being able to advance and being bypassed for opportunities to move up in the organization or make more money as compared to their white peers. And so I've spoken to Bud about this very frequently, and we've just, he's always said, like, this is not a new concept, but I think within that structure, one of the very vital parts of that is that there was, and what has been reported by Prince Lobel Ty, is that there was a deep distrust of management and a deep distrust of HR, and so there was a fear about speaking out in general. And so now we're seeing more people come to the fore, we're seeing more legal complaints being filed, we're seeing more investigations, we're still waiting on this audit from the state auditor's office. It should take them, they said, about upwards of a year and a half to come out with something, but they're looking into these allegations as well, and so this has been kind of brewing for a long time.
And Bud, you had mentioned, that a lot of folks were afraid to speak up and speak out about this.
Absolutely true and to the point. And I think folks were really afraid of retaliation. And things, this has been going on for a long time. It's been rumored in your windows, just the culture that existed. And until this report had come out to really substantiate a lot of what's going on over at that convention center. I know I first got involved and talked to Tori, and we had a conversation, and I made a couple statements, and met with the attorneys, and it was very difficult and hard to get people to come forward because this convention center had a culture that they would retaliate, and they would retaliate hard, and then you could lose a job, you could get depromoted. Many things went on. So it was just a breath of fresh air that the board hired. Gibbons, the executive director, actually hired the attorneys to investigate this. But it substantiates what a lot of us have always believed.
So, and speaking of that culture, we do have an excerpt from a letter from Jermaine Sparrock, who complained about a coworker's racist comments at a December 2022 office party. Now, this female complained about it to Sparrock and just didn't follow through this treatment. It reads in part, quote, "On the phone, she told me that she's all for racial justice and she advocates for it outside of work, but she cannot put herself at risk for losing her job over it. I assured her that she cannot be fired because of the situation, but she didn't believe me. On 1/5/23, Nicole decided to not go forward with the process officially." It seems like, from what I've read, and of course, Tori, you're the expert here, a lot of folks were bringing up these issues, but afraid to follow through because of this culture.
Yeah, so I want to clarify, that was his coworker, that's in his legal complaint that he filed over in June. She had heard at this pizza holiday party for the legal team, his manager, talking about how, he thought that Boston Latin School, which I guess he couldn't get into, was ruined because they let too many black people in, and was talking about busing and desegregation, and talking about people from Mattapan and just using very racist language to describe black people in Boston. And so she was relaying these things to him, and when so one of the things that's talked about in this report is that there's no system to go through, right? There is that distrust. Mm-hmm. And so he was told by his manager, let's not bring this to HR. He went through the proper channels. He actually showed me a letter that he wrote and signed and handed physically to a supervisor to show that he had filed a complaint, that he was uncomfortable about these comments. And that was then he was later told that they never received that letter, that he never wrote it, and that he was later, he says, retaliated against he was accused of retaliating against his female colleague who told him that, I know it's complicated, but basically she, for telling her that she should have reported it. Yeah. And so he was then in trouble. And I've seen that happen. I mean, according, these allegations of that happening, there's a pattern there where, in another case with Ms. Benjamin, who's another client who's represented by this man, Matt Fogelman, who's an attorney. He's representing a lot of these people bringing complaints forward more and more now. She was saying that when she tried to report racist comments that were made against her by members of the public safety team, they contacted their supervisors, and she was later written up and penalized for saying something. And so there are, allegations that show this kind of documented pattern of people being retaliated against, they say, for just raising complaints about racism, and those either peter out or they are then seen as a problem, they're seen as difficult, and they're later, given these kind of punishments, or they're not advanced as much when they have made these complaints.
So this was an internal review or report. So how, is there an estimation in terms of if there were anyone else looking into these particular issues outside of this report? So
we've got the state auditor's office, and we're all waiting for that report because, to their credit, the MCCA hired this law firm to do this internal report. They are an independent third-party entity, and I think that they address some of their own difficulties in speaking with employees because of that distrust. It was difficult for them to access people. It was difficult for them. I think at one point in this report they say that just because we couldn't get a lot of people to say that they had been treated disrespectfully or mistreated, that doesn't mean that it isn't happening because we had such a hard time getting folks to talk to us. I think that the state auditor's report is hopefully more expansive and hopefully more far-reaching, and I think we're all kind of waiting for that. But and Bud can speak to this as well. Changes already need to start happening. And so I do want to say that they have created, they have represented this issue with, now there's a task force to implement some of the recommendations from the report. Previously there was a task force. They appointed, I think last year, a chief diversity officer, which they're one of, I think, very few, if not the only private public entity, government authority that, like quasi-public agency that didn't have a chief diversity officer, but now they have Herschel Herndon. And so the work that he'll be doing, he'll be working closely with this task force. Hopefully they will be able to implement some of these changes. They have vowed to do so. I think that there are steps being taken, but it's all coming after exposure, after public exposure, after people have been calling for it for so long, after there's immense public pressure to do so. So we are eagerly awaiting the audit results, and that is, yet to come.
And Bud, so if this audit result from the state auditor's office mirrors or it even has more claims or complaints that we see from this private report, what then can happen on the state level to make sure that this type of thing doesn't continue to happen?
Well, I'll chime in a little heavier than that.
Yeah.
We don't need to wait for the state auditor's report. I'm very comfortable with the attorneys who worked on this. People have come forward. They're going to create this, and it's an ongoing. I think the attorneys are going to be there for a little while longer because right now I'm getting the phone calls that people now really believe. People always didn't believe in the process. They never believed that if they came forward against one of the most powerful quasi-agencies in the Commonwealth, that they would be retaliated against. Now that they see that the proof is in the pudding, that things are going to happen, you're going to get more and more people going to come forward. So right now, I think Governor Healy, to her credit, refocused the board, put many new board members on that board, and I think they have a responsibility to do something now. I don't need the auditor's report from the information I've received and reading the report, which is not final, Terry. I don't believe it's a final report as of yet. I think they have enough ammunition right now to make some structural changes. It's really embarrassing when you have folks who make complaints, racial complaints within a quasi-agency of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they fall on deaf ears. I mean, the emperor has no clothes. We know now that we have evidence, which we always really believe, but never had the written document, that needs big changes over there. They need to go from top to bottom, clean house, get some new leadership in there, and let's go forward.
I wonder about the conversation of the ability for this entity to police themselves. You mentioned a task force and some other internal things that are happening as a result of the report we have now by this private company. But is there a faith in the folks that you're talking to and that you're communicating with, Tori, that they can police themselves or course correct right now?
I think to build on what Bud said, we don't have to rely on them just policing themselves, not only because we're waiting for the audit, and we don't have to be waiting for the audit, but because of this report, and because, at the time of this investigation, there was one legal complaint filed with the Massachusetts Office Against Discrimination, and now there have been two, and there's a third one that's purportedly coming down the pipeline, and potentially more and more. And so I think those legal complaints, kind of building, and the pressure, the public pressure that's mounting, I think that is where we'll see a pressure for them to make these changes internally. Otherwise, there could be severe consequences, I think. And I think they know that now, and I think they have been at least publicly agreeing to be very cooperative with this and make it more of a priority, because as the report says, the financial bottom line has been the priority, and this has been really just it's just been a huge oversight. It's just not thought about, and it's been overlooked, and I think now, they say they're going to start making changes, so hopefully that happens.
Yeah, certainly this is a conversation we're going to continue to follow, in a story that I'm sure is still developing. Tori and Bud, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Crystal.
Next up, there has been no shortage of comments as we watch the horrific scenes playing out in Israel and Gaza, where several thousand Israelis and Palestinians have been killed in the last few weeks. Statements have poured in from pretty much every direction to comment on the Hamas attack and the war that's followed, including Amazon, American Eagle, the NFL, and even local fitness studios. Plenty of businesses have also taken heat for the way that they chose to acknowledge the violence. It raises a question. did we really need to hear from them about this in the first place? And what kind of responsibilities do companies have when tragedy strikes halfway around the world? I'm joined by Sandy Lish, principal and co-founder of the Castle Group, and Kelly Chun, principal of Kelly Chun and Associates, a collaborative consultancy based here in Boston. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Crystal.
So, you know, Sandy, I'll start with you. As we look at these companies figure out what to say, if to say something, and how their employees are reacting, I mean, what is the advice that you give folks that are under your purview?
Crystal, it is so complicated.
It is.
It's so subjective, and there's so many factors. So the first thing for anyone to think about is, why am I commenting? Is there a good reason? Is there something happening within my stakeholder group that drives me to have to? Is this just standard operating procedure and I always do, so by not commenting it's an omission and it's expected? Or is it just because everyone's doing it? Or, you know, chiming in and looking for attention? There's so many reasons. And so I think that is really where everybody must start. Why am I chiming in?
Yeah, Kelly,
Why?
Yeah.
Well, there are numerous reasons. I mean, we had this discussion at my classroom recently. I also teach at the BU College of Communication, and we were looking at some of the reasons why companies responded. One was purely logistical. You know, Delta, for example, you know, they wanted to make sure that their employees were safe, and they and other airlines were stopping flights between the United States and Tel Aviv, you know, for safety. You know, other organizations wanted to reflect their values. You know, Jamie Dimon, for example, Morgan Chase, he put out something where he unequivocally denounced the attack, but, you know, went further in acknowledging the history of the conflict and really advocating for peace in the region. So, you know, different kinds of statements, some reflecting an organization's values and feeling the need to express them. Other companies having business actually in the Mideast, employees. One company, I can't remember the name of it, they've been doing business in Israel for 60 years. So they put out, you know, an unequivocal statement, you know, condemning the attack. So it runs the gamut, and it does start with the why, as Sandy noted.
Is there a concern that, Sandy, that employees will be upset that there wasn't a larger conversation? And then how do you handle that if an employee decides to post on their own social media and that kind of thing?
So, Crystal, we're seeing all sorts of things play out, just like that, and for those reasons, right? In every sense of the spectrum. And the kinds of conflagrations that are happening in different businesses, people losing jobs, people being doxxed, people, you know, not feeling safe at work. All of those things are happening. I think what is important is to parse the difference between the statement that followed immediately following the attack. A terrorist attack by an organized terrorist group on innocent civilians. So Hamas terrorizing innocent Israeli, mostly Jewish civilians going about their everyday business. That, right, you know, in the wake of that, seems pretty cut and dried. And I think, you know, without getting into geopolitics, being able to denounce a terrorist attack on the face seems pretty safe. Where it becomes problematic is when organizations that really aren't in a position, like the fitness center that you referenced, but also many others, it's not their duty or responsibility to try to explain what is so complicated and so nuanced and so ancient. And, you know, and we've seen many instances where, because folks did try to do that, they were left with a bigger mess than they had ever anticipated.
Yeah, and Kelly, I'm also thoughtful of like towns, like I live in Arlington, and our Human Rights Commission put out a statement, and there was both praise and criticism for that. Like, where do you, at what point do you just say, we're gonna let the religious groups or the ethnic groups in that town sort of lead the conversation and sit back and sort of support whatever statement they put out, do you think?
Well, some of the faith-based groups have come together in support. others that are not in the faith community, the Boston City Council, for example,
Right.
I think there was some drama there in discussing this particular issue, the latest chapter, you know, in an ongoing drama with the City Council. But I think the faith-based community can be a calming force at a time that is so fraught and that is so emotional.
Yeah, definitely. You know, we want to pull in a piece of data that we got. A 2023 Gallup Bentley University Force for Good report on if businesses should weigh in on current events. Now, the question was, should businesses take a public stance on current events? And 59% of young people, we're talking about 18 to 29, said yes. But then when you go a little bit higher up the age scale, age 60 and over, 43%. Sandy, I'll start with you. Does that surprise you, those numbers?
It doesn't surprise me. I'm in neither of those groups, but it does surprise me, and because the younger folks have been accustomed to this. This is what they've grown up with. When George Floyd was killed, everybody was issuing a statement and a letter. When January 6th happened, lots of statements. So they have come to expect it, and older workers have not come to expect it. And I think it's also the nuance of what is shared openly and discussed openly is very different amongst younger generations than in older generations. What is considered to be, you know, you don't talk politics or money or what have you, or religion. The other thing too, and I do love that Bentley study. I saw that this morning too, and there's a lot of great data. That question is just such a blanket question. And so there's so much to dig into, and without, you know, with risking sounding like a broken record, when you're talking about communications, you have to really look at all the facts and all the context. There's not any like one right or wrong way.
Because it's not just did you or should you respond, it's how you respond that matters, right?
Exactly.
How, when, why, to whom, is it internal, is it external? I mean, it's, you know, it just goes on and
A lot
on.
of different factors.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, do these numbers, which, you know, as we see the breakdown of it, it seems like folks are really in the middle on the fence. You know, I don't, 30 to 44, 51%. 45 to 59, 41%. It doesn't seem like anyone is 100% or really skewed toward yes or skewed toward no. People are sort of sitting in the middle.
Well, the younger demographic, as Sandy noted, that doesn't really surprise me because they're the ones who, for the most part, are out in the street demonstrating. Many of the colleges, for example, Boston University had a demonstration a few weeks ago out in front of Marsh Chapel. There have been demonstrations in Copley Square, and I mean, all over. 100,000 people showed up on the streets of London. And a lot of those crowds are composed of young people who are used to demonstrating and talking about their feelings and just have a different level of comfort in talking about these controversial issues. The other data, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, I mean, of course. And I'm curious, though, when we're talking about these groups of folks that, Sandy, as you mentioned, have expected a reaction or to just sort of play things out publicly anyway, then how do you balance if you are in a C-suite trying to really not be necessarily distracted by current events, keep things going in a certain way, or have other messaging that you're trying to put out right now?
That's an excellent question, right? Because right in the wake of when something catastrophic happens, communicators look inside and say, wait, we were going to be releasing this, or we have this story we were going to pitch to Crystal's team at GBH, and this isn't a good time to do that. So that's real. That's a real thing. You have to not be tone deaf. But I guess, you know, in terms of when do you, or, you know, why do you, if you even decide to, it does go back to, is it expected? Do you have a reason, as Kelly said? You know, does this affect your business? Is there something happening because of this that's creating some sort of temperature within your institution? But I think, you know, the bottom line is stay in your lane, right? What is your lane? What is your reason? And what do you have to say about this? And don't try to bleed out into somebody else's lane, because that's when it really does become challenging.
And Kelly, you know, our team is looking at examples of this and prepping for the show and saw that, you know, a lot of companies or organizations in an effort to try to respond to everyone is sort of conflating things like responding to Black Lives Matter or even after January 6th or AAPI issues and things like that. And it seems like they're like, well, we responded to BLM, we have to respond to what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And conflating those issues has its own challenges and you know, dangers, really.
Exactly. Again, you know, what Sandy had said about start with the why.
Yeah.
Think about your target audience, think about your messaging, and what are the consequences of your putting out a statement. You know, each one of these issues is its own, you know, has its own lane, so to speak, and companies need to look at it that way. You know, that was then, this is now, that was this particular issue, this is a very different kind of issue. And the messaging requires attention to the moment and to not what you might and not to what you might have done in an earlier scenario.
I'm going to put you both on the spot a little bit. Is there any organization that you all know of that is handling this well in terms of, you know, their statement that they put out or their response or reaction or even their silence, you know, that kind of thing? Is there any place where you feel like is getting it right now in your opinions?
Well, I think that the article that you were quoted in PR Daily, where you talked about crisis communication specifically as it relates to the Middle East crisis, they pointed out the University of Arizona and the president who was responding to student activities on campus and having to not only condemn the terrorism act, you know, full stop, unequivocally, but also acknowledging the students' right to, you know, free speech and to free expression. You know, we may not agree with their advocacy, but they have every right, particularly on a college campus, to express their opinions. So making both statements very clear as to where the university stood, I thought they did a good job.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a good one. Sticking with higher ed, I think Tulane also did a fantastic job, very similar reasons. And I have learned that since then, I know there's a letter that's been signed by many, many institutional presidents, chancellors across the country that speaks with one voice. I thought that was excellent too. And that was organized, I think by Yeshiva University, but it's you know, bipartisan, non-secular, and there are presidents and chancellors from our region, too, that have signed it.
All right. Well, Sandy, Kelly, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's it for tonight, but we will be back tomorrow. I'm Crystal Haynes. Thank you for watching. Good night.
on Nova.